Good morning. At least I'm assuming that you're going to be watching this in the morning. It is good to be back from spring break. Welcome back. I hope that you all had a good Easter and spring vacation, and I hope everybody's healthy. In fact, I would really appreciate it if all of you would send me a message. Let me know that you're healthy. I would like to hear it from you. Uh, Everyone healthy at my house, and in fact, most people I know, although I have known a few people that had the coronavirus, all of them have recovered from it. So it seems like things are going pretty well. I hope it's going really well for you. Uh, we are going to kind of jump back in. It's not going to be a very long class today. I know the last one was pretty long, and I got into a lot of details about Benedict Arnold. Um, and right now, well, I should mention the fact that after that incident with Arnold and he switched sides, Washington tried to launch a effort to capture him. Was within a day of capturing him, but that effort failed. And Arnold actually came back with forces and started raiding various areas in both the north and even down into Richmond and Virginia. But he became a very active general for the South and for the South. Sorry, I was saying in the South there for a minute, but no, for the British, he became a very active general, and he was unfortunately very unrepentant. In fact, he sent letters to American generals asking them if it wasn't time that they should come over to his way of thinking about things, and wrote a letter to all of America explaining how he had been in the right all along, because when he had started this fight for our rights, he said it had been to protect our rights as English citizens, and no one was talking about independence. And that was true. He was saying that Congress had misled everyone, and that in order to really have their rights restored, what they needed to do was immediately switch sides and join the British. In the meantime, things had kind of cooled down up north. And as I mentioned last time, you're going to hear people, historians always talk about how, things cooled down in the north and then things began to really heat up in the southern. There was a new southern strategy. And it's just not quite true. It looks that way when you look back at history, but there had been attempts to capture Norfolk, Virginia in 76. And actually just a little bit before, I think on the edge of 75, 76, there had been efforts to capture Norfolk, Virginia. There had been marches into the South by the British. So it wasn't that there was a brand new strategy. It was just there was a little more focus there, and things slowed down in the North at the same time. So this week's paper, as you can see, is called Flying South. At the time, there were actually things called flying camps. The Americans had a flying camp, which is kind of a strange thing for us to think about because there was no part of the military that flew at the time, but that just meant it was meant to be a very fast-paced type of warfare. It's a lot of light infantry, a lot of horse troops, a lot of cavalry. Those are your flying camp, and those are very effective in waging war over these areas of the South that have a lot more open terrain than up in the northern states. So the first thing on our list here is a word that we've already talked about, but I'm bringing it back up because it becomes really important now. This is kind of the time where we see some strategies change. Throughout the first part of the war, Washington kept trying to fight battles that were very much so European battles. We would march in, face the enemy, and fight. Didn't always work so well, especially when we had raw militia and we didn't have coordinated, organized, and well-trained troops. Now that we had some more of those, we could do that some more, but that is exactly why the British kind of backed off at that point from focusing on that. They also recognized they weren't going to capture West Point easily. They didn't see an easy way to continue in the north, but they saw opportunities in the south. So in the south, we took up a Fabian strategy. And again, before we talked about this, a Fabian strategy is where large battles and frontal assaults are avoided in favor of wearing down an opponent through a war of attrition, which means you'll actually bleed away some, you'll lose some people, but you keep the war going. Attrition, also called grinding down, and indirection, while avoiding decisive battles. So you don't throw your whole army up and let them get wiped out. You snipe at the enemy. You hide out and you hit them from behind. You try and take out their supplies. You try and devastate them with surprise attacks, and then you retreat and disappear back into the forest. The side employing this strategy harasses its enemy through skirmishes to cause attrition, disrupt supply, and affect morale. Now, does that mean that the British were still lining up and trying to fire on us with, European battles, and we just wouldn't engage them that way? Not at all. The British had been fighting like this, just as we had, since the French and Indian War. They knew how to do it, and they were darn good at it, and especially Cornwallis, who is in the South now. Cornwallis is another one of these really interesting British commanders. He's brilliant militarily. He likes to stay in the field with his men. He is not one of these real arrogant, I'm above all of you type of people. He was someone who continually spent time with his troops. He slept in the field with his troops. He ate what they were eating. Is someone going to get the phone? Okay, good. Sorry about that. The hazards of recording your classes from home. At any rate, so he was a very, very good commander, and he was really someone who Washington had squared off with at Princeton, and we'd come away successful. But Cornwallis was really a successful commander through quite a bit of the war. And anyhow, so he's in the South, as I said. The Congress, which is our next word in your list here, the Congress had chosen 2 commanders of the Southern Army. All right, remember that at this point, Washington does not get to choose his commanders. They choose his commanders and tell him who he will be leading, which has sometimes been problematic. You remember that Charles Lee, not exactly warm and fuzzy to Washington, created problems, had to be removed. And Gates, even though we haven't really talked about it too much in our class, Horatio Gates was part of a group of people that became known as the Conway Cabal that were looking for ways to remove Washington from being general and put him in, that being Gates, in as the commander. Now remember, Gates won at Saratoga, largely because of the efforts of Benedict Arnold, but not only because of that. So he had a really important victory under his belt, and there were people in the Congress that wanted to see Gates become a general. Washington was very politically savvy. He received a letter that was not meant for him, and had opened it and started to read it when he realized this was not meant for him. And he resealed it with a note saying, my apologies, this was opened accidentally in my camp and is intended for you. And it was a letter where they were basically discussing how Washington was not up to the challenge and needs to be replaced. And so they knew that he knew that they'd been talking about him. And he worked back channels and made sure that Congress did not make any sudden moves. And in time, he kind of gave everyone enough rope, including Thomas Conway, who was a very strange officer. He was an Irish-born officer who had become a member of the French military and then volunteered for American service. So, the French-Irish-American revolutionary, he was one of the people who kind of was really in favor of replacing Washington. Real troublemaker, but his star, we will say, fell quite a bit, and so it was an opportunity that he missed the opportunity to get rid of Washington, and Washington pressed on. So, as I was saying, Congress chooses who's going to be underneath you, and one of those that's still underneath him is certainly Horatio Gates, General Gates. Gates will be one of the generals that we'll be talking about shortly, but the first general that we're talking about that was commander of the Southern Department, as they called it, was Benjamin Lincoln. General Benjamin Lincoln was a very loyal officer and a good general, not always the best general. And in the South, he was not having any type of luck. Um, he saw defeat at Savannah, Georgia, which was an invasion that was brought along with the French were trying to invade Savannah, Georgia to get it away from the British. Did not succeed. And then Charleston, South Carolina, which, yes, the word is actually Charlestown, but we say Charleston today. I think I probably wrote it both ways on your papers here. But in Charlestown, they lost the city, but he managed to hold up the army so that the militia could get away. And the British then captured General Benjamin Lincoln, treated him very badly, wouldn't let him honorably surrender because he irritated them in the fact that he'd let part of his army get away, and they, imprisoned him. He was released later, but so he was out of the action. So they replaced Benjamin Lincoln with Horatio Gates. And Gates really demonstrates here in the South more than anywhere else that he doesn't understand the army that's underneath him. He keeps trying to use them like a British army. Remember, he was trained as a British general, and he tries to continue to lead his troops the same as he would have a British army, which the American army never was never going to be. He has a huge amount of militia. Militia are notoriously unreliable. They tend to break, especially when charged with bayonets. And that's exactly what Cornwallis does at the Battle of Camden. He manages to charge in with bayonets and also cavalry, and the militia just folds up and runs. And it's been said, and seems to have some good provenance as far as this story, that as fast as the army was attempting to retreat, apparently Horatio Gates and his horse was much further ahead, retreating at full speed with his staff attempting to keep up with him. So kind of embarrassing. Battle of Camden, a lot of losses there. At any rate, so now we've had two big losses, and Congress kind of wises up. After the Battle of Camden, the Congress decided that it should let General Washington choose the next commander for the Southern Department. And he recommends Nathanael Greene, who has been loyal, who has been an excellent soldier during earlier part of the war. He asked Nathanael Greene to be a quartermaster, and he did not want to be quartermaster. In fact, he wrote, no one has ever heard of a famous quartermaster in history. And which is true. No one ever gets, praises and credits for being the great warrior who knew how to get supplies from one point to another. It's not something that generally gets a lot of fanfare, but it's critical. And he did a good job as a quartermaster, but he still was very, very thankful when he got back into the field. So they select Nathanael Greene, who, if you're looking at your paper, is the dashing young gentleman on the far left. He is, of course, originally from New England, not from the southern states. But he very quickly figures out, look, I have militia. I have soldiers that are not going to stand up and fight like normal warfare. We are going to be taking on Fabian tactics. And so they are making strikes and raids. In fact, at the bottom, you see this quote, which is a Greene quote. He says, "We fight, we get beat, we rise, and we fight again." Which is, very, I'd hate to be in the army where your general is saying this, but at the same time, he was really correct in how they had to fight this war. They had to continue to fight, even though they knew they couldn't win, go in, strike, get beaten back, regroup, and wait for your chance to fight again. And as long as they kept doing that, the British couldn't make any progress in the South. The problem was they couldn't be everywhere at once. So they'd go into a city, they'd go into a town, they'd take over. Greene would come and he'd hit them. And then they would come out of the town and chase after Greene and his men, And now they've got them far away from supplies and other things, and they disappear into the woods. And now you're not in control of that town anymore. And so they couldn't be everywhere at once. So it's like, yeah, we can capture this town, and then we can capture that town, and then we can capture this town over here. But they can't hold any of them because they have to leave them to go to the other one. They have, at this point, the British are in control of key portions of Georgia and South Carolina. Greene is in a bad state in the fact that how do you get supplies in when they control, these important ports and cities and areas? So they knew they had to live off the land. They had to get by with whatever little they could. The British have a 6,000 man army. The southern states at this point are in just tatters. They have no chance to actually supply anything to the American army. And they're led by General Cornwallis and a cavalry commander named Banastre Tarleton, who is maybe a little too overhyped as a villain in history. He certainly was a brutal fighter, and he certainly was demonized during the era for his attacks and being ruthless in his attacks. But he was very, very good at what he did. And so they have loyalist militia, but not a lot of army. So they do have military, they do have army, but they have a lot more militia. So now you got to picture this. In the South, you don't have a British army really fighting against an American army. You have American militia fighting against loyalist militia that are largely Americans. It's almost the Civil War. And it takes on the flavor of a civil war down in that area. So it's a very different fight than what we've been seeing up above. And the militias are just brutal, vicious towards each other. So outnumbered and undersupplied, the American generals settled on a strategy of guerrilla warfare called forest tactics or Indian tactics at the time, rather than pitched battles, in order to prevent the advance of the British into North Carolina and Virginia. So this was the big thing. He wanted to keep them from moving up north where they could do more damage and where they could threaten Washington and the Northern Army. So there's this desire to keep them fighting down here, delay them, slow them down, make it hard for them. Because that's what they want to do. They want to start from the southern position and keep marching up and taking cities all the way up until they can say that they've really, in spite of the fact that they can't hold towns, they're having better success in the South than they ever did in the North. And there's a lot of Southern loyalists. There's a lot of people down there that are like, we've always been British, and why wouldn't we continue to be? Actually, they would say English at the time. So important subordinate officers, which I have pictures of down here also in the Southern Campaign, were second in command Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, who is not, of course, pictured, but we've discussed von Steuben in the past. And then cavalry commander Henry Lee. He's also known as Light Horse Harry Lee. This is kind of an interesting character because great cavalry officer, really one of the founding cavalry officers for the United States. And you will hear the family name again. While he is not related to Charles Lee that we've heard from before, he is related to other Virginia Lees, including his son, which he has very late in life, which you can imagine must be the case, because his son goes on to be the General Lee that is the General Lee of the Civil War, once we hit the 1850s, 60s. Very, very, so it's very, one of those things that's kind of one of those head scratchers for a lot of people when they look at history as they go, oh my gosh, a Revolutionary War hero whose son becomes the head of the Southern Army in the Civil War. Then there's Daniel Morgan, known as the Old Wagoner, and Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, because he will be very, very good at keeping his men very active in the swamps and backwoods in the South, and especially in the Carolinas. Now, if some of this is sounding familiar to some of you, I cannot recommend from a historical point of view or even necessarily from a very artistic point of view. And I even think it may be, if it's not rated R, it's definitely a hard like PG-13 because there's a lot of violence and stuff in it. But the movie The Patriot was lifted loosely from a lot of these characters, including Francis Marion is the Mel Gibson character, and Bannister Tarleton, who is the British cavalry officer, is portrayed by the guy that played Lucius Malfoy in the Harry Potter films. Anyhow, it's not. I'm not recommending the film. I'm just saying if you've seen it and these are starting to sound like familiar kind of names, there's a reason. There was some loose connection. Movie is not historically accurate whatsoever. Please do not try and learn history from watching the movie The Patriot. It will gravely disappoint you. All right, so now that is for your paper. Now, your assignment this week is a little bit different, and I'm going to see if I can call up. Yes, here it is. I am putting together some names here that I want you to look up. They are, well, actually, I shouldn't say I want you to look them up. You don't need to look them all up. I want you to choose one. You can look at all of them and choose which one you want to pursue further, but I want you to write a basic biography that tells me who they are and what they did in the American Revolution. But you only need to pick one, and I'm going to give you 5, so there's plenty to choose from here. Their names are Casimir Pulaski, the Marquis de Lafayette, who we've discussed before, Tadeusz Kosciuszko, Bernardo de Galvez, and Johann de Kalb. Okay, if none of those names sound like your typical American military leader names, that's because none of them are your typical American military leaders. All of them, with the exception of Bernardo de Galvez, are volunteers in the American military during the war, but they're all foreigners. Bernardo de Galvez does great work in support of the American Revolution, but he is never in the American military forces. He is a Spanish military officer and governor, and he is active down in the Florida area, but his work is critical in supporting the American Revolution. And he has now been given American citizenship, even though he's, obviously long since dead. He is an honorary American citizen. In fact, I don't think there's anyone on this list that isn't now an American citizen. But not all these people survived the war. And so, whichever one you choose, you may have a little more biography than others. Of course, the Marquis de Lafayette we've discussed before, but we haven't really gotten into his story, and he's a very interesting character. So I will again list all those in the email to you, and you can choose which one you want to do a really mini, looking for maybe a half-page biography. I want you to find out who they are, where they're from, why they served in the American cause, what they did, and how their service turned out. I could have put the Baron on there also, but we've already talked about him considerably, so I just didn't feel that that was really necessary. But and these are not all of the foreign officers. You have to remember that we had Benjamin Franklin over in France, and he's finding all kinds of foreign officers who are willing to come and fight in America and sending them over because they know that we need experienced officers, that we don't have a lot of them. And Ben Franklin does a great job of getting a number. In fact, I'm not sure that any of these people didn't at least meet with Franklin before they came over. I think every one of them did at some point. And so some very interesting characters there. So again, I hope to get an email from you. By the time we have class next Wednesday, I expect that I will already have your papers. So by Wednesday morning, please have sent me your mini biography. and also telling me how you're doing. This is stretched on some time now, and it's kind of sunk into almost becoming a normal routine. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of people are getting a little tired of being in their houses. But anyhow, let me know how you're doing, and we will talk to you soon. Have a great week.